In this video lecture, we're going to look at the female reproductive system, looking at the anatomy, how the follicle develops within the ovary and the process of oogenesis, and then an overview of the ovarian and uterine cycles. And then in the next video, we'll look at how hormones affect those cycles. So starting with the anatomy, of course, we need to start with the ovary. That's the location for the egg development. Every month, about one egg will ovulate or leave the ovary and travel through the fallopian or oviduct, the fallopian tubes or the oviduct. Then from there, it enters the uterus, where it would embed in the lining of the uterus. It's called the endometrium, and grow for 9 months. The end of the uterus is called the cervix. This is the location for, of course, cervical cancer. To detect cervical cancer, a woman undergoes a pap smear every year. In the pap smear, a sample of cells is removed from the cervix and then looked at under a microscope. If the cells are abnormal, it indicates that they are precancerous, and then, of course, treatments would be indicative in those cases. There are a couple risk factors for cervical cancer. One is multiple pregnancies. That is, the more pregnancy you have, the higher risk you have of cervical cancer. And the other is the human papillomavirus, or HPV. This is a sexually transmitted virus that can often cause the cells of the cervix to become cancerous. Nowadays, we have a vaccine called Gardasil that's used to protect a woman from HPV and therefore prevent the majority of cervical cancers. The last section of the reproductive tract is going to be the vagina, and its job, of course, is to accept the penis during intercourse. Looking at the histology of the uterine wall, the outer layer is called the perimetrium. This is the external serosa layer, which isn't labeled on the diagram, but it'd be right along here. The layer inside of that is called the myometrium. This is the muscle layer. It's about 1 centimeter thick when you're not pregnant. It is all smooth muscle running in several different directions, so that when you have labor contractions, those smooth muscles will constrict and therefore expel the fetus during delivery. And then the inside layer is called the endometrium. You can see it here. It's divided into 2 layers called the stratum functionalis or stratum bacillus. The endometrium is composed of simple columnar epithelium. It's very vascular and glandular. It's, of course, high in nutrients, going to house our developing fetus. It's the functionalis layer that's sloughed off every month with your period. The basal layer is in charge of regenerating that functional layer after your menstrual cycle. Looking at oogenesis and follicle development, oogenesis again is the process by which an egg develops from an oogonium, which is the stem cell, and then of course follicle development is the cells around the developing oocyte that houses that oocyte, so to speak. So let's first start with the oogonium. We can actually start looking at what's going on before birth. Actually, there are 7 million original oogoniums. Those guys will undergo mitosis and develop into what are called primary oocytes. The primary oocyte is housed inside a primordial follicle, which is just a single layer of cells that around that primary oocyte. The primary oocyte then will continue or begin meiosis 1 and gets arrested in prophase 1. And it's that way all the way at birth and even through childhood. By the time you're born, of those 7 million oocytes that started, only 1 million of them are left. The rest of them end up undergoing programmed cell death or apoptosis. Of course, during childhood, the ovaries are inactive. Once you start puberty, and every month, a few of those primary oocytes or the primordial follicles will develop. Now, by the time you hit puberty, you've got about 300,000 oocytes left. What happens first, of course, the primordial follicle develops into a primary follicle. The primary follicle can be identified as just a 1-cell layer around the developing primary oocyte. Now, still the primary oocyte is arrested still in prophase 1. Every month, the dominant primary oocyte, or the dominant follicle, will continue to develop and become what's called the vesicular or Graafian follicle. That oocyte, that primary oocyte, then will finish meiosis 1 and become 2 cells, either the polar body or a secondary oocyte. And this is what distinguishes oogenesis from spermatogenesis. In spermatogenesis, you just end up with 2 cells exactly alike in that first meiotic division. Here, our 2 cells are very different. This first polar body is basically just the cell nucleus and no cytoplasm. The secondary oocyte here is all of this, the nucleus plus a lot of cytoplasm, and that means that secondary oocyte has all the nutrients, because it's all the nutrients contained within the cytoplasm that's going to help with the egg after it's been fertilized. So even though the first polar body may divide, don't really care because those polar bodies don't do anything, it's really the secondary oocyte that we care about. Again, now every month a few of those follicles will continue to develop, and only one of them, on average, ends up becoming that mature follicle, and that secondary oocyte now will start meiosis 2. But when it goes through meiosis 2, now it gets arrested in metaphase 2. Now, metaphase 2 is a step within meiosis 2, but it basically doesn't complete it. It's not going to complete meiosis 2 unless a sperm fertilizes it. So at the time of ovulation, when this mature follicle ruptures and releases the secondary oocyte into the fallopian tube, that secondary oocyte is in the middle of meiosis 2. It will complete meiosis 2 once a sperm penetrates it. And then it will have meiosis. Once it's completed meiosis 2, notice again you've got a second polar body, so a little dinky cell, and then a big cell has all the nutrients with it, plus the sperm's nuclei and the egg's nuclei. Those 2 nuclei then will fuse after that and form into the zygote. Now, in this slide, we're going to look at the follicle development, different stages of the follicle development, and the descriptions of that follicle development can be found in the following 2 slides. So you'll want to follow with those in the numbers. So first we start with the primordial follicle. This is the follicle we see an oogonium in. It's like that at birth and continues until puberty. Then you get the primary follicle. The primary follicle has a primary oocyte in it. The cells are more cuboidal in shape, usually only 1 cell layer thick, and FSH receptors begin to show up on the oocyte, so that's going to end up influencing the effect FSH has on the developing follicle and oocyte. The secondary oocyte is really only get one or more follicles every month. And these follicles usually are more than 1 layer thick. The cells are now called granulosa cells, and these granulosa cells can communicate with the developing oocyte through gap junctions. The next stage in follicle development is the vesicular follicle or mature follicle. You can identify a mature follicle by the presence of antrum, that is the fluid-filled cavity here, and the oocyte being surrounded by granulosa cells and sitting on kind of a stalk-like structure of those granulosa cells. Remember that the oocyte at this point is a secondary oocyte. It's arrested in the middle of meiosis 2 and waiting for ovulation. Once the cell ovulates, in the next step, then the remaining follicle cells are referred to as the corpus luteum. The corpus luteum is in charge of secreting estrogen and progesterones to help maintain the uterine lining for pregnancy. If there's no pregnancy, or let me start first. If pregnant, the corpus luteum persists until the placenta can take over as the structure to produce estrogen and progesterone. If no pregnancy occurs, then the corpus luteum degenerates into what's called the corpus albicans. Now, the picture indicates it seems like that the follicle moves along the edge of the ovary, but that's just to show the different stages. That is, any one follicle stays put where it is and continues its development at that spot. It's not going to rotate around the ovary. The other point is that this follicle development takes almost a full year for the follicle to develop. That is, whatever follicle ovulates that month actually started developing 10 to 12 months earlier. Now we're ready to look at the ovarian and uterine cycles. The ovarian cycle, of course, refers to what's going on in the ovaries, whereas the uterine cycle refers to what's going on with the uterus. On average, the ovarian and uterine cycles, of course, are timed together. They last about 28 days, but can range all the way from 21 to 40 days. Ovulation takes place 14 days before the end of the cycle. So if you had a 40-day cycle, then you would end up having ovulation on day 26. If you had a 21-day cycle, you would have ovulation occurring on day 7. So it can vary at the beginning of your cycle when you ovulate, and that's what makes it a little trickier to know when exactly you're ovulating, because you don't know 2 weeks ahead or how far ahead you're going to start your period. If we look at the ovarian and uterine cycles, we can see it's kind of a summary of what's going on here. We've got developing follicle here and then developed into the corpus luteum or the corpus albicans. So while the follicle is developing, we're going to call that the follicular phase. You can see here the follicles continue to develop, and that's followed by ovulation. And then the luteal phase is going to refer to what happens after ovulation, and that's the formation of the corpus luteum and its maintenance or degeneration to the corpus albicans. The menstrual cycle, of course, refers to what's going on in the uterus. So the first part of that is called the menstrual phase. This is when you have your period. Following your period then would be the proliferative phase, where the uterine lining is increasing in size. And following that would be the secretory phase, when the uterine lining starts secreting hormones and also is maintained at a thick layer in anticipation of pregnancy. So that's going to end our look at the female reproductive system. We'll look at how those hormones regulate the ovarian and uterine cycle in the next video lecture.